Good afternoon. I hope this message finds you doing well, and I pray that these videos have served you well thus far. I'd like to talk about, just for a few minutes this afternoon, another ship of Springvale. We talked about fellowship last time, and I'd like to talk about stewardship today. I'd like to return to the same passage that we read together last time, Acts chapter 2. Verses 42 and following. We find that the early church, they had devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. We talked about how they devoted themselves to fellowship, but they also devoted themselves to stewarding what they had. Stewardship. Verse 43, and awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and their belongings, and they're distributing the proceeds to all as they had need. And day by day they attended the temple, and they broke bread in their homes, and they received their food with glad and generous hearts. And they praised God, and the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. We find that the early church recognized something. They recognized that we all have gifts. We all have been given gifts by God. Some of us have more gifts, some of us have less gifts, but we all have been entrusted with things. And we find that the early church recognized that ultimately that the owner of those gifts are not us, but the Lord, the one who gave them to us to begin with. And they took those gifts and they used those gifts for the sake of the gospel. And the Lord used those gifts in a powerful way. And many people were saved because of their gospel living and their gospel sharing. We all have resources. We all have gifts. But probably the greatest gift, and not just probably, it is in fact the greatest gift that we have, is our salvation. And so the question for us today, firstly, is, are we sharing that gift of salvation? Are we stewarding that gift often? And are we stewarding that gift well? God has strategically placed us in context, in missional context. We're surrounded by people. We're surrounded by neighbors. We're surrounded by co-workers. We're surrounded by folks that we come in contact with on a day-to-day basis throughout the week. And so how well are we stewarding that gift of salvation? Are we sharing that? Are we giving that generously as the early church gave that generously? But not just sharing and being generous in our gospel giving, but our resources. We find that the early church recognized that they were just spiritual needs, but physical needs that surrounded them. And so how well are we using those physical gifts that God has given us to care for those that surround us? I'm standing in my kitchen this afternoon, and I'm touching probably one of the most useful gifts, useful tools that God has given us for gospel ministry, namely an oven. The early church spent a lot of time around the dinner table. They used the food that they were given and the homes that they were given as tools to point people to Jesus. And so how well are we doing that? How often are we doing that? I would like for you just to take a few moments this week to evaluate that. I want you to evaluate how well you're doing that individually, and I want you all to evaluate how well you're doing that as a small group, as a Sunday school class. My prayer for you is that you would steward those gifts to the best of your ability, for the glory of God and for the sake of the gospel, and that you would begin to do that often, and that you would begin to do that well, and that we would see what the early church saw. Countless multitudes saved because of God's generousness and our generousness. So may we be good stewards, and may we do it for Jesus' sake. Take care.